can experience joy with others, right? You can experience joy. That seems allowed, right? Like you can be happy, you can be carefree, you can have fun, you can be frivolous, innocent, joyful. Not me. Not for a long time, actually, until I did joy repression work. Let me ask you another few questions just to see where this lands, because if you find that you can't express some of these things, you may become interested in our repression work. So you can just be loving and affectionate towards all the people in your life, right? Even strangers, as long as it's safe. You can show affection to them, be loving, be open-hearted. Do you get any no on that? So you can get angry at people. You can express anger. You don't have to hold it back. You don't have to show up as a nice person or a peaceful person or spiritual person. You can just show up how you show up, right? When you're afraid, you can let people know. And it feels safe to do that. That just to let people know around you that you're afraid, to be that honest. What about shame? Can you admit to the people in your life the more shameful aspects of yourself? Can you speak openly about those things? Guilt. Is that something that you can express? You have no problem with. It's very easy for you to be vulnerable with other people, right? That comes naturally. When you pose the questions like this, it really illuminates it, doesn't it? If there's any repression in you, because you could feel the stopping, the no, I can't. For whatever reason, I can't. See, sometimes triggers are like inverse triggers. We've been talking about like the opposite of that in awakening work, enlightenment, even therapy. We talk about triggers as something affirmative, like I'm getting angry, I'm upset, affirmative. But what about the inverse? What about the absence of a response? What about those times when you're not able to express? Those are also triggers, the trigger to repress, to hold back, to not be yourself. That's a trigger that hides. The other triggers are fairly obvious. You can see it. Like, oh yeah, I'm angry. I'm triggered because I believe that she should be different than the way that she is. I'm upset at my boss. Obvious trigger. I'm afraid. Obvious. But how do you spot the things that are not obvious, that are not showing up in your experience? Until you ask specific questions like I did there, you may not even know that you repressed something. I didn't. So then what do you do now that you know that? Because probably your practices that you're already engaged in won't get to that, because the practices you're engaged in at the most maybe work with triggers that are like affirmative, like when you're upset. You have a process of inquiry or something where you just rest with that. But what do you do when something isn't showing up? Like you can't use that practice on that. The practice that you normally use for those overt triggers won't work here because this trigger isn't even arising. This thing is not even arising. Have you started to recognize presence, and then you look around and you go, I don't understand. Where's the bliss? Like, there's not really joy here. Or I don't actually love everyone. I don't feel that. You may even say, I don't even like most people, or whatever. So the thing is when we start to awaken to awareness, our true nature, we can begin asking these other questions. They get to the inverse triggers, the things that really hide. How would you know if you're repressing joy if you've been doing it all your life? There's not anything that's going to show up in your experience that's going to be like, oh yeah, that's joy repression, because it's absent. The joy is absent. So how are you going to spot the absence of something that's repressed if you've spent a whole lifetime hiding that from yourself? What is it that's going to come in now and show it to you? Probably nothing. unless one of these questions gets entertained. Like, I can feel and show joy to people. That kind of question or that statement can finally bring it up for you, the no. Or if you say, I can feel and express anger to people in my life, no. Sometimes it's not until you ask a question like that or an inquiry like that that you even know that there is a trigger there, an inverse trigger. Most people, when they discover these repressions, they become very interested in those triggers because they are triggers that have eluded them their whole life. And what I'm seeing in sessions with people is embodiment, empowerment, like coming back online, feeling more authentically yourself, feeling like you're not people pleasing as much, that you're not living for other people, less sense of caring what other people think about you, showing up exactly as you show up. And that feels very liberating for people. Very, very liberating. I know what that's like. So these inverse triggers have just as much richness as the other triggers, maybe even more, to work with these because of the nature of them. To repress is to hold back self, to hold back expression. And that cannot be liberating. By its very nature, it's not liberating, it's holding back. I think that if you have a tendency to repress already, the non-dual teachings can strengthen the repression very easily, or any practice could do that. Meditation practice. Hear me out. I'm aware that this kind of talk, that there's resistance to it. And the resistance sometimes comes up like, I don't have that. I'm not repressing anything. But the ego that represses would say that, wouldn't it? That's exactly what it would say. It would deny the existence of these things because that's the mechanism of repression. So these are really hard to spot. Really hard to spot. And yet not spotting them could be a big miss because, again, holding back, holding down, you cannot transcend what you're holding down. Cannot transcend what you're avoiding. Cannot transcend what you're repressing. So if there's repression, how can you say even that you've seen through self? Like, you can't really hold on to that flag or plant that flag in the ground. You can't say, I've seen through no self. What? Which aspect of self are you talking about? Are you talking about the one that you don't even allow to arise? Saw through that? How? Have you seen through the one, the aspect of ego that represses? Have you seen through that? Maybe you've seen through the one that doesn't repress, that the activity does repress. But have you seen through that aspect of self? That's also an aspect of self. Repress in order to stay safe, repress in order to protect myself, repress in order to get other people's love and attention and approval, repress. I'm doing this video because there's a number of you who have come to me and said, when you first started talking about this, Scott, I was shaking my head like, first of all, why is Scott sharing about this? What's this have to do with non-duality? And or, even if he is onto something, I don't repress. And some of those same people now are deep in repression work because they recognize that that response itself was the repression, the mechanism of hiding things from ourselves. It is very clever mechanism. Sometimes even when we have an inkling that we're repressing, we don't have a real consciousness of that. We just have the inkling. So we may see in certain situations where it's like we want to say something, but we find ourselves staying quiet. Or we're irritated with someone near us, we're even angry because for whatever reason, but we're not saying it. Instead, we're just punishing them in our mind, being upset in our mind, unable to express the anger, so therefore shut down. But there's a whole host of other things. Maybe anger is very comfortable for you, but you have difficulty expressing the more vulnerable emotions. You have difficulty saying in a moment that you feel weak, or that you're afraid, or ashamed, then that's what you're repressing. And we're the last to know. We are really the last to know when there's repression. Even people around us will know it before we know it. They'll know that we hold back, that we're hiding our anger or hiding our emotions, or they know it because they have to deal with it all the time. They cannot not see it, but there's nothing that they can do about it until we start to spot it within ourselves. And then we can do something about it. But until then, it's just stuff that other people have to deal with. But here's the thing, other people might like your repressions. So they might not even be motivated to tell you about it. So they may see that you don't get angry and that you tend to not rock the boat and you're agreeable or a good listener, and they like that about you because you don't bring conflict into the equation. So you may be getting love from them out of repressing. So even if they see it, they may not say it to you. But I have to say it to you because here we're interested in radical freedom. We're not interested in just getting love and attention from others. We're taking this deeply, this question of self, not just the self that's conscious, but all aspects of it, the unconscious aspects. Immediately after doing the joy repression work, I felt more joy, natural joy. And there'd always been joy there. Don't get me wrong. Joy has been something that's been a part of my realization, lightness, childlikeness. But there's an aspect of it that was repressed, had to do with relationship, learning to repress those things in order to survive in a family. That that was a completely different mechanism. That was something in relationship. That's trauma based. So doing that work to lift that repression and along with the other repressions brought a much deeper sense of embodiment and empowerment. And frankly, working on anger repression allowed more joy. And being able to express joy allowed more anger. Like they all came online. Because when you repress one aspect of self, you have a tendency to repress others. So strangely, some of the signs of freedom for people who've repressed is they might be more vocal. So whereas other people are finding that the realization of awareness makes them very quiet and their triggers, their overt triggers fall away. For someone who's repressed, when they've been quiet all their life, their expression or their freedom may show up as expression, as being able to say something, and even being able to be upset, being able to welcome that and feel that and not repress it. But in the non-dual world, you might not see that as transformation. Other people may see that and say, oh, he's just angry. He's just giving a viewpoint. He's just sharing another ego-based viewpoint. If you measure people's realization through their quietness, you're going to miss something because the quietness can be a hiding place for those that repress. And so we may show up as quiet, but we only do that by repressing a whole lot of stuff. So you may look at us and say, oh, he's very quiet, must be free. When in fact, we're in bondage. So the measure of someone's realization isn't necessarily how quiet they are. What I see is people coming alive. The energy in their body shifts, like the light starts to come through, like literal energy shifts happening with this word. Whereas before someone was rather shut down and timid and submissive, quiet, disempowered, the energy reflected that, the shutdown state. Literally, the energy feels shut down. And then as they do the repression work, the energy shifts and like the light comes on. And they can't even see it sometimes. But I pointed out to them, like, And they'll say, yeah, I do actually feel a lot different. But they can't see the transformation like we can see it from the outside, how the energy shifts and the person just shows up differently. And the person isn't showing up as just serene quietness. There's an aliveness there. When the repression work is done, the aliveness can come online. It's not just quiet, empty stillness. That's there. But through that, there's this aliveness that comes on as there's no longer repression happening. Like you can feel it, you can see it in their eyes. They're alive, they're awake. They have access to all the emotions that they didn't have access to before. So energy is flowing. Instead of stagnating in certain areas, contractions, pain, it's flowing. And that shows up in their experience, their body, literally, when you're with them. And yet we might not recognize that if we just said that the test is whether someone is quiet or that they look peaceful. Peaceful egos look peaceful. Any ego that represses anger is going to come off looking rather peaceful, for example. Repression goes deep because what I'm finding with people who, for example, have low level anxiety or constant anxiety, like a feeling of being unsafe, they may think that even the anxiety or the fear is not repressed, like they're feeling it all the time. But come to find out, the only way that they were able to survive was to repress part of the fear. So they don't just have anxiety regularly, they have a contraction somewhere in the body, maybe stomach, chest, that holds a lot of repressed fear. So what they're feeling is actually just that fear that's conscious, like right on the surface. They've protected themselves from the bulk of it, holding it in, not consciously, holding it in a certain area. And that contributes to the suffering as that contraction holds that fear in. It has all the repressed thoughts in it about self. So they're surprised to find out that even as the anxiety on the surface starts to die down, there's a deeper discovery of that which they've repressed in the contraction. And that's a greater sense of freedom there, is to go all the way down into that and lift that up. And our worst enemy in repression work is our mind, because the mind will say all kinds of things like, I don't want to feel that. It'll get out of control. I'll be overwhelmed. I'll have a panic attack or something like that. But if you have skill, that's not going to happen. And even if those energies come up, you're going to know how to be with that and regulate that. So the mind throws up all these antics or these blocks that stop the work from happening. You have to watch out for that. Because when we start going into what you've repressed, we're really getting down to some of the core aspects of ego that had to survive by repressing. So when you start playing with that, the mind goes, no, no, it's the repressing mind comes up again to say, no, don't go there. It'll be too much. But if you can inquire all the way through that, the actual experience of it is liberating, even if you have to feel some pain along the way, to discharge that energy in the body, let it go. Very, very deep realization when you take it that far into the contractions that are holding this stuff. Spiritual seekers especially have to be careful with repression, I think, because what gets us on the path is part of it is running away from pain, trying to figure out a way to get around the pain and maybe become enlightened so I don't have to feel the pain. So there's a game of avoidance going on already in the spiritual path, especially if you have practices that reinforce avoidance, including practices that try to transcend and move beyond the world, like transcend out of it, there can be some movement of repressing and avoiding that just happens with that already. That the path itself is kind of designed for it. Is I'm not any of the things that are rising and falling on the awareness. So you can see how we would lean on that, even to the extent of pushing things away, right? So there's that tendency to push things away or avoid sometimes in that recognition. And that's what's going to reinforce the repression. It's a lot like this. So if you're someone who represses things already, let's say anger, then you come to a meeting where you're encouraged to be quiet. When your system has been quiet forever, your system's already been quiet, and that's how you repressed. So then you might be doing practices that actually subtly reinforce that. It's almost like the quietness becomes like almost institutionalized or solidified with the practices. And you're even rewarded for it. Like, oh yeah, you're very quiet. You have a nice meditative practice. Meanwhile, you could be reinforcing repression. It's so easy to do with this kind of work. So what does one do if that's the case? You got to expose yourself to inquiry or something that's going to bring that up. So you're going to have to find those areas where you're holding things down, find inquiry that skillfully brings it up. Otherwise, it's just going to stay quiet while you're doing your practices. It's just right there under the surface. Proactive inquiry to pull it up. We have a whole set of inquiries for that. Follow me to the new forum and I'll show them to you. And I'll support you through it. Because you need support through it. There's a lot that can happen when you're bringing repression up. But here I'm not even talking about the repression inquiry. That's something that we'll do together on the new forum. So we're going to have this new forum coming up where you can come and get much more interactivity with us, the facilitators, where we're supporting you regularly in inquiry. But this is not about that. This is for those folks who may not even realize right now how their spiritual practice is reinforcing repression. They just don't know it. So this is what this talk is about. And really all you can do is look for the signs. It's not like the repression is just going to come up and show itself to you like, oh yeah, here it all is. It's just going to show you little things like listen for your language. Listen how you talk about anger and other emotions. If you subtly or not so subtly vilify them, make them bad or wrong, that can be evidence of repression, just how you language things. Evidence of repression could be in the moment of being with someone where you feel a desire to say something, but you shut down instead. Evidence of repression could be like, where's the joy? Like that sense of like, okay, I'm living in presence now, but I don't really feel the joy, or something is missing. It's flat. People say it's dry because something hasn't been embodied. Something that's repressed, trauma, something. Signs. Conflict in relationship is a sign. If you're holding back in relationship, you're not expressing your real needs and wants and setting your boundaries. That creates problems in relationship. Sign. Chronic pain, illness can be a sign, like it was for me. You have to be really aware of these different signs because they're just going to show you something. And they're not going to show it all to you. It's just like a little bit of a glimpse into something is going on. These little signs that come up. And then you have to really turn towards it skillfully once you know it's there. Sign would be there's a great deal of your life that's still very secret. So with regard to your addictions or something, maybe there are secrets that you're holding that you cannot share with other people because you've repressed the shame. You feel it so deeply that your mouth will not utter the words and open up to someone else. Sign. If you're walking around earth wondering where your anger is. Like you're having these deep realizations and experiences, but it's like, but I still don't get angry. Sign right there. If you feel sadness wanting to come up, but it's like it just gets choked out, and it fully can't come up, like it may be too scary. Sign. If you're not able to abide fully as awareness, that could be a sign. So repressions have a way of creating that oscillation, like because we're having to respond in relationship inauthentically constantly. So when we're not able to abide as awareness, it could be in aspects of ourselves that are just not conscious yet. And those are creating these issues, this oscillation. That could be a sign, just not being able to abide as this. Something hasn't been included. Just a sign. Stomach contraction, for example, that's very persistent. Sign of repression and trauma. Even low level anxiety, constant ongoing anxiety that you cannot get through. There's nothing that you do that ever really takes it away. That's a sign that there's fear repressed or something repressed under that holds it all together. There are so many signs for us if we'll just pay attention. So that's all I'm trying to do is to plant the seed in you, because if you see any of these things, you may become interested in this topic, repression of anything, including even things like gender, sexuality, sexual orientation. If you're in the closet around something, sign. That's actually not good for your health, believe it or not. There's studies around how repressing our sexual orientation or some gender aspect can create chronic pain and stress. It's bad for our health. So if you're holding back on that, if you're holding a secret around that and not able to be yourself, it can be a sign of repression. Now you have the signs. If you're interested in the work, we're going to be setting up a platform, and a lot of it's going to be devoted to doing this deeper work and supporting people in that. So just stay tuned here and on my Facebook page for the announcement of that. If you found the signs today, you're probably going to become interested in how do I inquire into this. And that's a whole nother conversation. The reason I'm so good for your health is because I was so bad with my health. Repressing anger was incredibly bad for my health. So that's why I live to tell about it. I'm like the example of what not to do. You follow me? Like, don't do what I did. That's why I'm talking about it every day. It's like, you don't have to do what I did. You don't have to get to the place where you're suicidal because of chronic pain. You don't have to, possibly. You don't have to. If you'll listen and just follow what I'm saying, get a handle on some of this.